The Riverlands had seen enough blood to fill the Trident twice over. 3 kings were dead or dying, and the 4th had just lost his head at the twins. The crows had grown fat on Westerosi ambition, and the small folk who survived did so by learning a single essential truth: stay invisible, stay quiet, stay alive. It was into this exhausted, blood-soaked landscape that the stranger appeared. Not through any door, not on any road, but simply there, face down in the mud of a riverbank, with 3 arrows buried in his back, and no horse, no sigil, no name. The shepherd boy who found him ran. That was the smart choice. The Lannister patrol that found him next made a different one. There were 6 of them, gold cloaks reassigned to the Riverlands to remind the small folk that the Lion still ruled. Even here, where the land changed hands like a losing hand of cards. Their sergeant was a thick-necked man named Polliver. Not the famous one, just a man unlucky enough to share a name with infamy. And he saw a body in the mud and thought, easy work. Strip the corpse, check for coin. Move on. The body moved first. Logan came up out of the river mud the way bad memories surface. Suddenly and completely, with no warning and no apology. The arrows in his back were already pushed out, the wounds already closing, skin knitting itself together with a faint, wet sound that made the nearest soldier step backward into his own horse. Logan stood in the gray morning light of the Riverlands, mud-caked and soaking, wearing clothes that were wrong in ways the soldiers couldn't name. Strange weave, strange cut, no house colors, no sigil. And he was not tall. He was not particularly imposing to look at. But there was something about the way he stood, weight forward, shoulders dropped, head slightly lowered, that made every man present reconsider the arithmetic of the situation. "Walk away," Logan said. His voice was rough and flat and carried no particular threat in it, which was somehow worse than shouting. It was the voice of a man who had already calculated the outcome and was offering them the courtesy of ignorance. Polliver, unlucky name, unlucky day, drew his sword. 3 seconds later, 6 Lannister soldiers were on the ground, and Logan was standing among them, wiping his knuckles on his thigh. The claws had come out and gone back without conscious thought, the way breathing happens. He looked at his hands for a moment, or at the way the adamantium caught the thin morning light, and then he looked at the landscape around him. Wrong trees, wrong sky, wrong smell. The air tasted of wood smoke and river cold and something older underneath. Something pre-industrial that tugged at memories from his earliest years, from before the wars that had names and before the wars that didn't. He'd been in places like this. He'd fought in places like this, back when the world was younger, and so was he, or at least hadn't yet stopped pretending. He crouched and examined the dead men's armor. Lion sigil, well-made iron, hand-forged. No synthetic materials, no machine stitching. The swords were real swords, not props. He picked one up, tested the balance, set it down. He checked the bodies for a map and found a crude one, hand-drawn on vellum. Actual vellum, on her actual animal skin, showing something called the Trident to the east and something called the King's Road running north-south like a spine. "Okay," he said to nobody. He'd woken in stranger places. He'd woken in weapon labs and jungle cages, and once in the middle of the ocean with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He had a process for this, worn smooth by repetition. Find food, find shelter, find information. Don't trust anyone until you have to. The process had kept him alive for over a century. He saw no reason to abandon it now. He took the best of the dead men's cloaks, a nondescript brown, thankfully no lion on it, and the most detailed map, and a wineskin that turned out to contain something sharp and dark that tasted like the medieval scotch he'd had once in Scotland during a year he didn't like to think about. He drank half of it standing over the bodies and then started walking north, because north was where cold was, and cold he understood. The Riverlands watched him go with its usual expression, which was the expression of a land that had been fought over so many times it had stopped having opinions about it. Burned farmhouses, empty villages. The skeletal remains of a harvest that nobody had lived to bring in. He passed a crow-picked corpse hanging from a tree wearing a sign he couldn't read. The language was close to something he knew, close enough to puzzle out if he stopped to try, but he didn't stop. He'd seen enough hanged men to last several lifetimes, and he had several lifetimes of reference material. What struck him and kept striking him as he walked was the silence. No engines, no aircraft overhead, no distant highway hum. He just wind and birds and the sound of a world going about the old slow business of being a world. Part of him, the part that had lived long enough to remember what silence actually sounded like, recognized it. The rest of him filed it under wrong and kept moving. He smelled the village before he saw it. Wood smoke and bread and animals and the specific human scent of fear, which he learned to identify the same way a sommelier learns to identify wine, by long exposure and grim expertise. He came over a rise and looked down at a cluster of buildings around a well, and at the cluster of people who had stopped their morning work to stare at the stranger on the hill. He raised one hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement. After a long moment, an old woman at the well raised hers back. He went down. If you want to see more characters dropped into impossible worlds, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The village was called Millhaven, or something close enough that Logan stopped trying to catch the exact pronunciation, and it had 17 people left in it out of the 43 who'd lived there before the war. The old woman's name was Mira, and she had the eyes of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world intended to be terrible and had decided to be useful anyway. She looked at Logan the way she probably looked at everything, measuring its practical value. She fed him, hard bread and a gray stew that tasted better than it looked, which wasn't difficult. Eat far. She nodded as though this was a far. Very far. She nodded as though this was a satisfying answer. In a land where everyone was trying to seem like they came from somewhere powerful, a man who admitted he came from nowhere was either a fool or something else entirely. She seemed to have decided on something else. Those Lannister men, she said, not looking at him, the patrol that was due through this morning, they won't be coming. She was quiet for a moment. Then, there'll be more. There always are, he said, and she looked at him sharply, because he'd said it with the weariness of someone who had personal, extensive experience with the principle, not just the abstract truth of it. And he stayed the night on a straw bed that was better than the mud and worse than most things he'd slept on. He lay in the dark and listened to the village breathe and tried to work out where he was. Not when. When was a problem for later, and he'd learned not to spiral on temporal questions because they went nowhere useful. But where, in the sense of what kind of place this was, what its rules were, who held power and how. From what he'd gathered across the meal and the old woman's careful, oblique conversation. There was a boy king in a distant city who sat a throne made of swords. There were great families fighting over who got to control that boy. The North was different, colder, harder, more honest in its violence. And there was something beyond the North, beyond a great wall of ice, foreign that everyone mentioned the way people mention things they're trying not to think about. He thought about the arrows that had been in his back when he woke up. 3 arrows. Somebody had shot him, somewhere, in whatever transition had dropped him here. Something had tried to kill him, and he'd survived it, the way he survived everything, and now he was here. He closed his eyes. Outside, a wolf howled somewhere in the dark hills, a real wolf, large by the sound of it. And he felt something in his chest respond to it, some old animal recognition. Yeah, he thought, I know how you feel. He was gone before the village woke up, not out of ingratitude. The bread and the stew and the straw bed had been genuine kindnesses, and he'd left the best of the Lannister swords propped against the old woman's door where she'd find it in the morning. Hannah, a practical gift. In a world like this one, he was already understanding. Practical was the only kind that mattered, but staying meant bringing whatever came looking for those 6 dead soldiers down on 17 people who had already lost more than half their number to other men's wars, and that was a calculation he'd made enough times to do it in his sleep. He followed the King's Road north, staying off the road itself and moving parallel through the tree line, which was an old habit that had nothing to do with this particular world and everything to do with outliving it. 3 hours of walking in the gray pre-dawn, enhanced senses sorting the landscape into layers, The distant smell of a cook fire, 2 miles east. Horses, maybe 8 of them, south and moving away. So in the particular stillness that meant a large predator had been through recently, and the smaller animals were still deciding whether to come back out. The North, Mira had said, with a particular weight to the word, like it was a different country inside the country, like it meant something beyond geography. He was still thinking about that when he smelled the ambush. 4 men in the trees ahead, upwind from most directions, but not from his. Unwashed, nervous, armed, the specific smell of men who had been living rough for weeks and were about to do something violent. He stopped walking, stood still in the tree shadow and waited, because sometimes waiting was enough. It wasn't enough. They came out with crossbows leveled and the kind of desperate confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose. Ragged sigils on their jerkins, much from travelers what the war had taken from them, from travelers what the war had taken from them. Purse and cloak, the lead one said. He was young, maybe 20, with a scar across his chin, and eyes that had seen the specific education that comes from watching people you trusted get killed. And the boots if they fit. Logan looked at the 4 crossbows and made the same calculation he always made, which was essentially, how much do I want to avoid this? The answer today was reasonably much. He was trying to gather information, not bodies. You don't want to do this, he said. Funny, that's not how want works when you're starving. The young one kept the crossbow level. His hands were steady. I would to see something that'll scare you. I'm to see something that'll scare you. I'm telling you now, so nobody does anything stupid when it happens. What? He extended the claws. Just the claws on his right hand, slow and deliberate, 12 inches of adamantium catching the thin morning light between the trees. The sound they made coming out was the sound of something fundamental and wrong, a metal-on-metal whisper that didn't belong in a world of forged iron and honest steel. Silence. Then one of the crossbows fired. The man on the far left, nerves making the decision before his brain could. And the bolt took Logan in the shoulder, and he didn't move. Didn't flinch. Who just stood there with a crossbow bolt in his shoulder and 12 inches of impossible metal coming out of his knuckles, and looked at them with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something older than anger, something that had been anger so many times it had burned down to just a kind of tired certainty. He reached up and pulled the bolt out. The wound closed. He dropped the bolt in the mud. The 4 men ran. He watched them go, retracted the claws, and rolled his shoulder until the last of the healing itch faded. Then he continued north, because that was the plan, and he saw no reason to revise it on account of crossbow bolts. He heard Harrenhal before he saw it. Not with his ears. The castle was silent in the way that massive abandoned things are silent, which is a different silence than empty silence, weighted and aware of itself. Well, he heard it with whatever sense had no name, the one that had kept him alive through a century of situations that should have killed him, the one that read a place's history in the quality of its air. Harrenhal had history the way a wound has infection. Too much of it, in too concentrated a form, gone bad. He came out of the tree line and looked at it in the flat afternoon light. He'd seen castles. He'd fought in castles, stormed castles, watched castles burn in 2 world wars and assorted smaller conflicts that history had largely forgotten. He'd never seen anything quite like this. The specific visual grammar of massive ambition destroyed by something more massive. The towers weren't just ruined. They were melted, stone that had flowed like wax and rehardened into shapes that stone shouldn't make. Dragonfire, he'd understand later, does something hot enough and sustained enough to treat stone the way a blowtorch treats plastic. The gates were open. Technically, there were no gates. They'd been removed months ago by whatever force had last held the castle, which changed hands so regularly that the scorch marks on the walls represented a historical record. He went in, because shelter was shelter and he'd slept in worse. What he found inside was not empty. The woman was sitting beside a fire in the great hall. Vast as an aircraft hangar, half the roof open to the sky, weeds growing through the flagstones, with the self-possessed stillness of someone who had been waiting and had no particular problem with waiting. She was red-haired and striking in a way that bypassed attractive and went directly to significant, the way certain people just occupy more reality than others. See, she wore red robes that seemed too clean for the ruin around her, and she was looking at him with an expression that suggested he was not a surprise. "I wondered when you would arrive," she said. Her accent was foreign, Eastern, he'd learned, from a place called Ashai, and her common tongue was precise in the way that people who learned a language as adults make it precise. "You were waiting for me specifically," Logan said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was waiting for what the Lord of Light sent." She tilted her head. "Whether that is you specifically, we shall determine." He came and sat across the fire from her because his feet were tired and the fire was warm, and he'd learned decades ago that the most unsettling thing you could do to someone who expected to unsettle you was to be practical about it. He looked at her directly, when she looked back. "The fires showed me a man who could not die," she said, "who came from beyond the world's edge carrying metal bones and the memory of 100 years of war, who was neither living nor dead but something between." She paused. "The Lord of Light speaks in images. Interpretation is," she smiled slightly, "an imperfect art." "I'm not a religious experience," he said. "No, you are a weapon." She said it without judgment, almost with compassion. "But then, the Lord of Light has never been particular about the vessels he chooses. He uses what is available, what will survive what he sends it into." Logan looked at the fire for a moment, at the way it moved, at the way she watched it move, her eyes tracking something in the flames that he couldn't see. "What's coming?" he said. "That thing north of the wall. You're worried about it." Something shifted in her face. The composure was still there, but underneath it, something that might have been fear on a less disciplined person. "Worried," she said carefully, "is a very small word for what I am." He nodded slowly. He understood that particular construction. The feeling that the available vocabulary was insufficient for the scale of the thing you were facing. He'd had that feeling before, usually right before things got significantly worse. "Tell me about the North," he said. "Tell me about the wall. Tell me about what's behind it." Melisandre looked at him across the fire, and the flames reflected in her eyes, and she began to speak. Outside, the wind moved through Harrenhal's broken towers with a sound like breathing, like something vast and old shifting in its sleep, not yet awake. But getting there. Melisandre talked until the fire burned low, and Logan listened the way he'd learned to listen over a century of gathering intelligence in places where bad information got you killed. Completely without interrupting, filing everything and reserving judgment until the picture was complete enough to be useful. The picture, when complete, was not encouraging. An army of the dead, a night king of unclear origin and apparently absolute purpose, a wall of ice 70 miles long and 700 feet high that had held for 8,000 years and was, by her account, approaching the end of its reliable service life. The dead didn't tire, didn't feel cold, didn't negotiate, didn't stop. They converted their kills into their own numbers, one which was the kind of logistics advantage that military strategists dreamed about and hoped never to face. And commanding them was something that had been human once, long ago, and had since become a different category of problem entirely. "How many?" he asked when she paused. "The count grows daily, tens of thousands, perhaps more. And the wall stops them. The wall and what was placed within it." She was careful with that sentence, choosing the words with the precision of someone who understood that some information, shared too early, was more dangerous than useful. Magic older than the current age of the world, wards and workings that have held because the Night King has not yet found what he needs to break them. "What does he need?" She looked at him for a long moment. "A dragon," she said. "Aaron or something of equivalent power." He thought about that, about the melted towers of Harrenhal visible through the broken roof, about the specific kind of power that turned stone into something that flowed. "Dragons are real," he said, "not a question." He was updating his model of the world rapidly, slotting in new variables, and he lived long enough to know that ruling things out on principle was how you got killed by them. 3 remain. They belong to a queen across the narrow sea who is currently occupied with her own wars. A pause. "She is coming," the fire suggested. "But whether she arrives in time and whether she can be made to understand the true nature of the threat before political complications consume her attention, Melisandre spread her hands. In a gesture that encompassed the full difficulty of trying to coordinate human beings around an existential problem. Logan recognized that gesture. He'd seen it on the faces of generals and spy masters across 100 years of conflicts, where the enemy was simple and the allies were not. "So the dead are the simple part," he said. She looked at him with something approaching respect. "Yes, precisely." He sat with that for a moment. Then, "Why me? Whatever your Lord of Light thinks I am, why drop me here instead of somewhere that already has answers?" "Because the answers are in the north," she said, "and the north is where no one with power wants to go. The great lords play their Game of Thrones and watch the horizon to the south, for enemies they understand, wearing faces they recognize. They have been playing this game for generations. And it is comfortable to them, even at its most violent." She looked at the fire again. "What comes from the north is not comfortable. It does not play the game. It does not want the throne. It wants nothing that can be bargained with or defeated by politics. And you think I can do something about that?" "I think you cannot be turned into a white," she said simply. "I think you have fought things that terrified you and continued fighting. I think you understand war at its most honest, which is to say war without ideology or justice, war as pure force meeting force." She met his eyes. "And I think you have been looking for something to fight that deserves what you are capable of." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through Harrenhal. He didn't tell her she was wrong, because she wasn't entirely. When he left at dawn, and she didn't try to stop him, which raised her several notches in his estimation. People who understood when not to push were people who had paid attention to how the world actually worked. He went north. The King's Road thinned as the riverlands gave way to rougher country, the soil going stonier and the vegetation changing register from the soft greens of a landscape that expected to be farmed into the harder, more self-sufficient growth of land that had given up waiting for people to maintain it. He passed through the Neck, a vast bog that smelled of peat and ancient water, and things that had been growing uninterrupted for longer than the civilizations currently fighting over the territory further south. Narrow causeways, treacherous mud on either side. He necked into the northern reaches when he was 2 days past the Neck, and into the northern reaches when he found the Stark boys. Or rather, when they found him. He'd made camp in the ruins of a shepherd's hut, roof partially intact, enough to keep the wind off, and was eating something he'd hunted and was trying not to evaluate too critically when he heard them coming. Two of them, young, moving through the trees with the specific combination of woodcraft and impatience that meant trained but not experienced. One moved better than the other. The better one had a direwolf with him. He could smell it before he could smell the boy, which told him something about the size of the animal. He didn't move. He sat by a small fire and waited. Bran Stark came out of the tree line first, riding a large man's back with the particular self-possession of a boy who had lost the use of his legs and compensated by developing an unusual relationship with inevitability. The large man was named Hodor, which Logan would learn was both his name and the full extent of his vocabulary, and he carried the boy with a gentleness that was its own kind of eloquence. Behind them came the better-moving boy, Jojen Reed, sharp-eyed and pale and already looking at Logan with an expression that suggested he was not surprised to find him here. The direwolf came last. It was approximately the size of a small horse, gray-furred, and it looked at Logan with yellow eyes that were doing the same kind of assessment his were. Logan looked back at it. It didn't growl. He didn't move. After a long moment, the direwolf sat down. "Summer likes you," Bran said, with the satisfied tone of a boy whose primary metric for judging strangers was his wolf's opinion of them. "He doesn't usually like strangers." "Smart animal," Logan said. Jojen Reed was still watching him with those disconcerting eyes, green and very steady, the eyes of someone who had seen too much of things that hadn't happened yet to be particularly agitated by things that were happening now. "You're the man from the fire," he said, "the one with metal in his bones." Logan looked at him carefully. "You dreamed about me." "I dream about many things." A pause. "Most of them are true." Logan thought about Melisandre and her flames, and Jojen Reed and his green dreams, and the specific exhaustion of being in a world where multiple independent mystical systems had independently decided you were worth paying attention to. What did you dream? Jojen sat down on a fallen log with the deliberateness of someone conserving energy for something more important than standing. I dreamed a man who couldn't die walking into the cold, and the cold parting around him, and something very old and very afraid. He looked at Logan with those unsettling, steady eyes. The cold was afraid. I've never dreamed the cold afraid before. Bran was watching this exchange with bright, serious eyes. He was young, 10, maybe 11, but there was something behind his youth, something that sat in him the way a tenant sits in a house that's older than they are. The fall from the tower had broken his legs. Logan would eventually learn, but it had opened something else entirely. We're going north, Bran said, beyond the wall. I know, Logan said, though he hadn't known until that moment. So am I. Summer made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite agreement, something in between. The fire popped. The northern dark pressed in around the ruin's edges, cold and heavy and full of something that was still too far away to smell, but was out there, he was increasingly certain, moving steadily south. You should eat, he said, gesturing at the fire. Whatever this is, there's enough. Bran looked at Hodor, who said Hodor, which apparently meant yes, and they came and sat by the fire, this strange company of broken boys and dreaming seers, and one very large wolf. Don Logan fed them and asked careful questions and listened more than he spoke, and built his picture of the world one piece at a time. The north had its own gravity. He could feel it pulling. He'd always been better at cold than at warmth anyway. The wall was visible for half a day before they reached it. That was the thing nobody told you about the wall. Not the height, which was staggering, not the age, which was incomprehensible, but the visibility. It sat on the horizon like a second sky, white and absolute, and it did not get closer the way normal things got closer as you walked toward them. It simply grew, incrementally, the way a god might grow if a god were made of ice and patience and the accumulated weight of 8,000 years of holding something back. Logan had seen the Rocky Mountains from a distance. He'd seen the Alps. Castle Black sat at its base like a barnacle on a whale, functional, necessary, and deeply aware of its own smallness. He'd left Bran and Jojen and Hodor at a village 2 days south with firm instructions and the kind of look that communicated without ambiguity that the instructions were not optional. Bran had argued. He was a Stark, apparently, and arguing was a Stark inheritance along with the gray eyes and the bone-deep stubbornness. Logan had listened to the argument and then repeated the instructions, and eventually Bran had subsided with the expression of someone who was filing this away to circumvent later, in a which Logan recognized and respected and was prepared to address when it happened. He went to Castle Black alone because Castle Black was military, and military establishments processed lone arrivals more cleanly than groups containing children. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. The Night's Watch was not what he'd expected, which had admittedly been a low bar. Melisandre had described them with the particular diplomacy of someone trying to be accurate without being cruel. Depleted was the word she'd used, diminished in number and quality both. What he found at Castle Black was somewhere between a garrison and a ghost. 800 men where there had once been thousands, wearing black that had faded to gray, maintaining walls and weapons and routines with the specific dogged competence of an institution that had outlasted its cultural relevance and was waiting to find out whether history would vindicate or bury it. The Lord Commander was a young man named Jon Snow, which was the name given to bastards in the North, which told Logan something about the man's history before the man opened his mouth. He had the stark gray eyes and the stark stillness, and something else besides, something that sat in him like Bran's passenger sat in Bran. Not a presence exactly, but an awareness, like someone who had died and come back and was still in the process of updating their understanding of what that meant. Logan understood that particular condition intimately. Snow received him in the Lord Commander's quarters, which were functional and cold and decorated with maps. He looked at Logan the way competent young commanders looked at unknown variables, carefully without hostility, but with the clear understanding that unknown variables in his specific situation had a strong historical tendency to become problems. You came from the South, Snow said, not an accusation, an establishing of facts. Through it, Logan said. I'm not from there. Where then? Logan had been thinking about how to answer this question since the Riverlands. He'd settled on a version of the truth that was true enough to be consistent under questioning and incomplete enough to avoid conversations he didn't have time for. Far away, further than your maps go. I came through something I don't fully understand, and I ended up here. He paused. I've been told the more important question is what's on the other side of your wall. Something moved in Snow's eyes. The specific movement of someone who has been trying to convince people of something important and keeps watching their urgency fail to transfer. Who told you that? A red woman in Harrenhal, a green dreaming boy in the neck. And honestly, Logan said, the smell of the air. Something's wrong with the air up here. There's a cold in it that isn't weather. Snow looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood and went to the window and looked at the wall. And Logan watched him do it and understood that this was a man who had been north of the wall, who had seen what was there, and who had been living with the knowledge ever since in a world that mostly preferred not to believe him. How many people have you told, Logan asked. Everyone I can reach. The bitterness was controlled but audible. The lords, the king, anyone with men to spare and walls to defend. A pause. They're fighting each other. Yeah, Logan said. I noticed. He told Snow about the 6 Lannister soldiers in the Riverlands, about Harrenhal, about Melisandre and her fires, about Jojen's green dreams. He told it plainly and completely, the way he'd learned to file reports in the wars that had had proper command structures, just the facts, sequenced correctly without editorializing. Snow listened the same way Logan had listened to Melisandre, completely and without interrupting. When Logan finished, Snow said, "Show me." Logan looked at him. "What she told you about, what you are." Snow met his eyes steadily. I need to know what you're capable of before I decide what to do with you." It was a reasonable request. Logan had made similar ones, in similar rooms, when unknown quantities had walked into his command and claimed to be useful. He extended the claws, all 6 this time, both hands the full declaration of what he was, and watched Snow's face go through the sequence. Shock, assessment, acceptance. The young Lord Commander had clearly developed an unusually high threshold for things that shouldn't exist. "They go through armor?" Snow asked. "Everything," Logan said. "Whites wear armor sometimes, taken from dead rangers." Snow was already thinking tactically, already slotting this new variable into his calculations. "Good," that was the right response. "Can you tell if someone's been turned? Not before it's visible?" "I can smell death," Logan said. "Fresh death and old death smell different. Whites," he thought about what Melisandre had described, "probably smell like cold and old blood and something else besides. I'll know when I'm close enough." Snow nodded slowly. Then he said something that Logan hadn't expected from a young man who had every reason to hoard what little power he had. "I'll take you north of the wall," he said. "There's a ranging going out in 3 days. You should see what we're facing before you decide if you want to help." "I've already decided," Logan said. Snow looked at him. "Why? You don't know this land. You don't know these people." It was a fair question. Logan thought about how to answer it honestly without giving more than was useful. He thought about Mira and her practical eyes, and the 4 desperate men with crossbows who'd run rather than die, and Bran Stark with his broken legs and his unbroken stubbornness, and Jojen Reed dreaming of cold that was afraid. "Because nobody else is," he said finally, "and I've had enough of watching things go wrong because the people who could do something decided it wasn't their problem." Snow held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, just once, the nod of one soldier recognizing another. 3 days, he said. "The ranging leaves at first light." The Night's Watch regarded Logan the way institutional men always regarded outsiders, with the specific territorial suspicion of people whose identity was bound up in a membership that the outsider hadn't earned. He ignored it with the ease of long practice. He'd been the outsider in more organizations than he could count, and in more centuries than most of the Watch's collective history covered, and the pattern was always the same. Prove yourself useful, prove yourself reliable, and eventually the suspicion either converted to acceptance or calcified into something he could work around. He spent the 3 days learning Castle Black the way he'd learned every fortification he'd ever operated from, systematically, quietly, with attention to the details that institutional familiarity caused inhabitants to stop seeing. The wall's elevator mechanism, the tunnel through the base, how quickly it could be sealed. Sight lines, choke points, the location of the armory, and the quality of its contents. The contents were not impressive. Iron swords, mostly. Some dragon glass, black volcanic glass. Us obsidian was stored in insufficient quantities in a back room, as though someone had received it and not been entirely sure what to do with it. He picked up a dragon glass dagger and tested the edge. Sharp, very sharp, given the material. "Kills them," said a voice behind him. Gruff, weathered, northern. He turned to find an old man with a weathered face and one hand, who had the quality of someone who had been underestimated so long he'd made it into a survival strategy. Dolorous Ed, he'd learned. Whites, dragon glass through the heart, or fire. Normal steel doesn't do much. "What about Valyrian steel?" Logan asked because he'd heard the term and filed it. "That too. Don't ask me why. It just does." Ed regarded the rack of dragon glass weapons with an expression of profound, unsatisfied gloom. "There's not enough. Haha, there's never enough of anything up here." Logan set the dagger down and looked at the inadequate stockpile, and the inadequate garrison, and the inadequate everything, and felt something settle in his chest like a familiar weight. This was the kind of situation he'd been in before, the kind that looked impossible from outside and merely very bad from inside, the kind where the gap between what was needed and what was available had to be filled with something. Improvisation, fury, the stubborn refusal to accept the arithmetic. He was good at filling gaps. Outside, the wall rose into the gray northern sky, holding back the dark by sheer accumulated will, and somewhere beyond it, something that had been moving south for a very long time continued, patient and cold and absolute, to move. The ranging went north at first light, as promised. 12 men in black, Jon Snow at the head, Logan somewhere in the middle where he could watch everything at once. A position he'd defaulted to in every military formation he'd ever moved with, which covered a span of history that would have made the Night's Watch's entire institutional memory look like a footnote. The tunnel through the wall's base took several minutes to traverse, and he spent those minutes listening to the ice above him, to the specific acoustic quality of 700 feet of frozen water transmitting the vibration of wind across its surface, a sound like the earth breathing slowly through clenched teeth. Then they were through, and the world changed. It wasn't subtle. The forest on the south side of the wall was dark and cold, and felt old in the way that old-growth forests felt old. Accumulated time, deep roots, or the weight of centuries of undisturbed growth. The forest on the north side felt old differently, like a clock that had stopped, like a room that had been sealed and the air inside it had been breathed and rebreathed until it was something other than air. The trees were the same species, roughly, the same dark conifers bending under the same gray sky. But they were quiet in a way that went beyond the absence of sound. The birds were gone. The small animal rustling that formed the continuous background texture of any living woodland was absent. The wind moved through the branches and the branches moved, and nothing else did. "You feel it," Snow said. He dropped back to walk beside Logan, watching his face. "Hard not to," Logan said. "First time north, most men don't feel anything for a while. War takes a few miles for it to settle in." Snow looked at the tree line. "You felt it before we were through the tunnel?" "I'm sensitive to that kind of thing." He didn't elaborate. Snow didn't push, which continued to distinguish him favorably from most commanders Logan had served under, temporarily and otherwise. They moved in formation, 2 outriders ahead, the rest in a column close enough for mutual support. Weapons loose. The Rangers moved like men who had done this before and found it unpleasant each time, and had not yet found a way to make peace with the unpleasantness. Competent, careful, afraid in the functional way that kept you alive, rather than the paralyzing way that got you killed. Logan smelled them at 4 miles. It was, as he'd theorized to Snow, distinct from the smell of ordinary death, which he knew well enough to categorize by age and cause and circumstance. This was cold death. Death that had been preserved rather than allowed to decompose, that had been reanimated without any of the biological processes that normally follow dying. There was no rot in it, which was somehow worse than rot. Rot was natural. Rot was the world recycling itself. Rot acknowledged that something had ended. This smell acknowledged nothing. It was death that had forgotten its purpose. He put his fist up. The signal he'd established with Snow, who'd integrated it into the column's operating procedure with impressive speed, and the column stopped. Ahead, he said quietly. Downwind. Can't count them yet. The smell's too diffuse. Spread formation, maybe. Snow turned to his men with hand signals that were efficient and clearly practiced. The column spread, weapons raised, moving into the trees with the particular, slow deliberateness of people who had learned that speed in this environment was how you walked into something you couldn't walk back out of. Logan went straight ahead because his senses gave him an advantage in that direction that made the flanking movements a better allocation of the other men. He found the whites in a clearing. There were 11 of them arranged in a rough line that might have been accidental and might not have been, standing with the specific stillness of things that didn't need to conserve energy because they'd moved past the point where energy was a relevant concept. They wore the remnants of Night's Watch blacks, which told him these had been Rangers once. Oh no, and they wore them with the indifference of things that had forgotten what clothing was for. Their eyes were blue, a vivid, wrong blue, the blue of something illuminated from inside by a light that had no business being there. He'd been told about the eyes. Seeing them was different from being told. He stood at the clearing's edge and looked at them, and they looked back, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the nearest one moved, a lurch, not a step, as though it was remembering how locomotion worked from a description rather than experience. And the line came forward, and Logan went in. The claws were out before conscious thought, and he learned several things in the next 30 seconds that he filed carefully for future reference. First, they didn't feel pain, which he'd expected, but they also didn't have the combat instincts of living fighters, which he hadn't fully accounted for. They moved toward the threat rather than around it, which was tactically poor and made them easier to handle than a living opponent of equivalent size and strength. But they made up for tactical poverty with absolute commitment, no self-preservation instinct, no hesitation, no retreating to reassess. Second, they were strong. Not supernaturally strong, not beyond what he'd encountered in various enhanced opponents over the years, but strong in the way that things are strong when they're not governing their exertion to avoid self-damage. A living man hitting something as hard as he could still pulled the strike slightly, unconsciously, because his body understood it was a body. These didn't. Third, and most importantly, the claws worked. Adamantium through the chest cavity didn't stop them. They didn't need their hearts, apparently. But adamantium through the neck, severing the head, did. And where the metal passed through white flesh, it left something behind, a brief bloom of what he could only describe as wrongness reacting to the disruption, the reanimated tissue seeming to resist the adamantium, specifically in a way it didn't resist the steel swords the Rangers were using elsewhere in the clearing. He filed that too, for later. 11 whites in 40 seconds, the last 3 taken down as the Rangers arrived to finish them with dragon glass and fire. So Snow stood at the clearing's edge and looked at the result with an expression that combined professional assessment with something more personal. Relief that had nowhere comfortable to land because the larger problem hadn't changed. You did that without armor, one of the Rangers said. He was a big man, northerner through and through, with the specific tone of someone whose framework for impressive was being rapidly renegotiated. Armor slows me down, Logan said. He was examining his hands, the knuckles where the claws retracted, making sure the mechanism was clean. And I heal. We saw, the Ranger said. He'd taken a white's arm across his shoulder before Logan had reached him, and was applying pressure to a wound that Logan could smell hadn't hit anything essential. What are you? It was a different question in this world than it was in his. In his world, it had technical answers, most of them classified. Here it landed differently. in a world where the categories were gods and men and things that were neither. Something that doesn't die easy, he said, which was true and sufficient. Snow was looking at the collapsed whites with a calculating expression. They were ranging further south than the last report, he said to no one in particular. The perimeter is moving. How fast? Faster than it was. He met Logan's eyes. We need to go back. I need to send ravens. To the lords who aren't listening. To everyone. A pause, the frustration of a man who had run out of alternatives and had to keep trying the ones that hadn't worked because the alternative to trying was surrender. Asha, someone has to listen eventually. Logan looked at the dead whites, at the wrong blue fading from their eyes as whatever had animated them dissipated. He thought about what Melisandre had said about the Night King needing a dragon to break the wall. He thought about 3 dragons across a narrow sea in the hands of a queen occupied with her own politics. He thought about the lords of Westeros fighting over a sword-covered chair while this moved south. There's another option, he said. Snow looked at him. Stop waiting for the lords to come to you. Someone needs to go south and make this impossible to ignore. He looked at the tree line, at the gray northern sky, at the wall visible above the canopy behind them, immense and absolute and increasingly insufficient. Not a raven, not a letter. Someone who can walk into a throne room and demonstrate the problem in terms that can't be politically inconvenient. You're talking about a living white, Snow said slowly. I'm talking about evidence. The kind you can't dismiss. He looked at Snow. Can it be done? Capture one intact? Snow was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. It's possible. Dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Yeah, Logan said. Most things worth doing are. The wind came through the dead clearing, moving the hair of the collapsed whites without moving anything that lived. Cold settled into the space between Logan's words and Snow's response, patient and ancient and absolutely indifferent to the plans of the small warm things making them. Snow looked north for a long moment. Then he looked at Logan. Did I know someone who might help with that, he said, south of the wall. He's not easy to deal with. I'm not easy to deal with either, Logan said. Should be a good conversation. The man Snow had in mind was called Tormund Giantsbane, which was apparently a name he'd given himself, which told Logan most of what he needed to know about the man before meeting him. He was being held loosely in the way that large, dangerous animals are loosely held by enclosures designed for smaller, dangerous animals, in one of Castle Black's lower cells, which was less a cell than a room with a locked door that Tormund had clearly decided not to break down out of some combination of political calculation and genuine, if grudging, respect for Snow's authority. He was enormous, red-bearded, and radiated the specific energy of a man who had survived so many things that had tried to kill him that he'd stopped bothering to arrange his face into expressions that acknowledged danger. He looked at Logan the way Logan had looked at the whites, assessing, categorizing, filing. Free folk, Snow had explained on the way down. Wildlings, south of the wall, would say. He's been south of the wall before, ranging with me. He knows the real north. He knows the terrain, and he knows the walker patterns better than any man in the watch. And he'll help because he wants his people south of the wall before winter fully sets in. And that requires the lords of Westeros to stop treating free folk as enemies long enough to let them through, which requires the lords to understand what's coming. Snow had paused. Heinrich, his interests and ours align. He's aware of that. Tormund is many things, but he's not stupid. The conversation with Tormund lasted 2 hours and was conducted primarily in a mixture of the common tongue and what Logan gathered was a free folk dialect, with Snow translating the portions that deviated too far from anything Logan could parse. Tormund's negotiating style was direct in the way that geological events were direct. Not aggressive, exactly, but completely uninterested in indirection. He said what he meant. He expected what he was told. He had no patience for politics, which Logan found refreshing in a world that seemed to run on little else. When Snow explained the white capture plan, Tormund looked at Logan for a long time. You, he said in the common tongue, with the specific directness of someone cutting to the point, quote, you go north with me. You smell them, yes? Like a dog? Better than a dog, Logan said. Tormund considered this. He looked at Logan's hands where the knuckles showed the slight ridge of the claw housings beneath the skin. He'd heard about the claws from the Rangers, evidently. In Tormund's world, where a man's worth was measured in concrete and immediate terms, what can you do? What have you survived? What will you stand in front of? The claws were simply a capability to be assessed, not a thing to fear or marvel at. Metal bones, Tormund said, all the way through. Good. He turned to Snow. We go in 4 days, east of the Fist of the First Men, where the dead things gather thickest. We take 12 men, take one of them alive. He used the word alive with the awareness that it was technically wrong and the indifference of someone who'd made peace with the world's imprecision. Bring it south. Show the lords. He looked back at Logan. You understand what we're walking into? Something very cold that wants to kill us, Logan said. Tormund's beard split into something that was probably a smile. Good. Men who understand what they're walking into live longer than men who don't. A pause. You also die less than normal men, yes? The Rangers say you pulled an arrow from your back. 3 arrows. Tormund seemed to find this genuinely satisfying, in the way that men who respect toughness above most other qualities find the evidence of extreme toughness satisfying. It was a comprehensible value system. Logan had operated inside it before. I won several centuries and several wars. 4 days, Tormund said, and lay back on his cot with the finality of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to keep discussing it. On the 3rd day, Ramsay Bolton's men arrived at Castle Black. There were 20 of them, wearing the flayed man's sigil that Logan had learned to recognize as the heraldry of the region's most efficiently terrible lordship. They came with a letter bearing the Bolton seal, addressed to the Lord Commander, and the letter's tone was the specific tone of a man who had power and had never developed the habit of apologizing for it. Logan read it over Snow's shoulder. His literacy in the language was functional now, assembled from 3 weeks of immersion and a brain that had done this before in German, Japanese, Vietnamese, when in several languages that no longer had living native speakers. The letter informed the Lord Commander that Sansa Stark was in Winterfell under Lord Bolton's protection, that the Lord Commander's interference in matters of the North was neither welcome nor advisable, that a bastard's authority extended to the Wall and no further, and that if the Night's Watch continued to shelter enemies of House Bolton, Lord Bolton would be forced to reconsider his contributions to the Wall's defense. Snow's face went through several things while he read it. The gray eyes went very still. Logan waited. Sansa is my sister, Snow said. His voice was controlled in the way that very cold things are controlled. Not calm, but frozen. Half-sister. She was supposed to be... He stopped. Started again. She escaped a situation in King's Landing. If she's in Winterfell with Bolton... She's not there willingly, Logan said. It wasn't a guess. The letter's phrasing, protection, with its particular emphasis, was the phrasing of a man who wanted his possession noted and his ownership established. No, Snow set the letter down. No, she's not. Logan looked at the 20 Bolton men in Castle Black's yard, warming themselves at the fire that hospitality required Snow to provide, wearing the flayed man like it was a normal thing to wear. He thought about what he'd heard of Ramsay Bolton in the past weeks, assembled from fragments. The villages Mira had described, emptied by men loyal to the flayed man. The specific kind of fear that attached to his name, different from the fear that attached to other powerful names, more intimate and more inventive. And there was a category of person Logan had encountered across his life that he had no patience for, had never developed patience for despite a century of trying to be strategic about it. The category was not violent. He was violent. Many people he respected were violent. Violence was a fact of the world he inhabited. The category was cruel for its own sake. Men who did what Ramsay Bolton did not, because it served a purpose, but because the doing of it was the purpose. He stood at the window and looked at the Bolton men and felt something old and hot move through him that he kept carefully leashed. The ranging leaves tomorrow, he said. Yes. Bolton's men? Will be asked to leave today. Snow looked at him. I'm going to write back. What are you going to say? Snow was quiet for a moment. Then, the truth, that she's my sister. That he has no right to her, that I'm coming. He picked up the letter, looked at the seal. It may start a war. It may, Logan agreed. You think I shouldn't? I think, Logan said carefully, that there's a thing north of your wall that ends all wars permanently if it's not stopped. I think that's the priority. He paused. I also think a man who runs a torture operation out of his ancestral seat and then sends threatening letters to military commanders is the kind of problem that only gets worse if left alone. Another pause. So I think you write the letter. And I think after we come back from the north with our evidence, we deal with what happens next. Snow looked at him steadily. And if we don't come back? It was an honest question. Logan respected it. Then the letter gets Bolton's attention pointed north instead of south, and he said, and maybe that buys your wall another few weeks. He held Snow's gaze. But we're coming back. He said it the way he said things he'd decided were true and intended to make true through whatever application of force and stubbornness was required. Snow looked at him for a long moment, and something in the young Lord Commander's expression shifted. Not to comfort exactly, but to the specific resolution that came from deciding that doubt was a luxury the situation couldn't afford. He wrote the letter. It went south with the Bolton men, who left Castle Black as the sun was going down, riding into the early winter dark with the self-important haste of men carrying a message their lord had told them was important. Logan watched them go from the wall's top. When 700 feet up, the world spread out below him in the last gray light. The forest south, the forest north, the cold line of the horizon where the two darknesses met. Somewhere out there in the northern dark, something moved steadily south. Somewhere to the south, a man read a letter and decided how to be angry about it. Between the two of them, Logan stood on a wall of ice and breathed the cold air and felt the claw housings ache very slightly in the extreme cold, which was as close as his body came anymore to discomfort, and thought about the gap between what was needed and what was available. Tomorrow they went north. Whatever happened after that, happened after that. They went northeast from Castle Black into country that got progressively quieter the further they pushed. 13 of them total, Snow and Logan, Tormund and 9 Freefolk Rangers who moved through the frozen landscape with the ease of people who had grown up treating the impossible north as simply home, plus 2 Night's Watch veterans who Tormund had approved of with the particular selectivity of a man who had watched a lot of other men die and developed strong opinions about which ones were worth standing next to. They traveled light and fast, which in this terrain meant slower than Logan would have preferred, the snow deepening as they moved away from the wall's marginal thermal influence into country that had given itself over entirely to winter. Tormund set the pace, and the pace was punishing. Logan kept it without difficulty. Snow kept it through will. The free folk kept it through lifelong conditioning that had made this landscape into something their bodies understood. And the Watch veterans kept it through the specific stubbornness of men who refused to be the ones who slowed things down. On the second night, they made camp in the lee of a granite outcropping. No fire, Tormund's rule. Absolute and non-negotiable, because fire north of the wall was a signal, and signals in this particular darkness were not sent to anything you wanted to hear back from. Logan sat in the dark and listened to the landscape and tried to build a picture of what was out there from what his senses could reach. The smell had been growing for 2 days. That cold death smell, the non-rot of preserved mortality, getting denser and more directional as they moved further from the wall. It was coming from the east and slightly north, and which matched what Tormund had said about the gathering patterns. The dead things congregated around certain points, the way weather systems congregated around certain geographic features, for reasons that were probably magical and were definitely strategic. How many? Snow asked quietly, sitting beside him in the dark. Hard to say yet. The cold affects how the smell carries. Logan thought about it. More than we want to see. Less than we can't handle, probably. A pause. Probably. Tormund's voice came from the other side of the outcropping, low and certain. We go in before dawn. Find the edge of the group, not the center. Take the one that's most separated, bring it down fast, bind it before it calls to the others. He'd clearly done some version of this calculus before, or something close enough to it that the variables were familiar. The chains are iron. They don't feel pain, but they feel restraint. And if they hear it, one of the free folk asked, Then we run, Tormund said, with the absolute simplicity of a man who had decided that honest answers were more useful than reassuring ones. Logan lay back against the cold granite and looked at the sky, which was extraordinary up here. Clearer than any sky he'd seen in a century of increasingly light-polluted nights, the stars dense and indifferent overhead. He'd grown up under skies like this, or close to it, in times before electricity had blurred the distinction between night and day. There was something in the clarity of it that was almost peaceful, if you didn't think too hard about what was moving through the dark below it. He thought about Bran, so 2 days south. The boy would have moved by now, he was certain. The specific look of preemptive apology Bran had given him when accepting the instructions had communicated clearly that the instructions were a temporary courtesy, not a genuine commitment. Whatever Bran was moving toward, beyond the wall, in the three-eyed raven's cave or wherever the green dreams led, Logan had been in this world long enough to understand that some things moved according to a logic that preceded and exceeded any individual's tactical preferences. He hoped the boy was careful. He didn't have significant faith that the boy was careful. Before dawn they moved, and Logan went first because his senses gave him the margin that made going first survivable. The white camp, if camp was even the word, or if camp implied anything like intention or comfort, was in a frozen valley between two ridges, and it was larger than he'd hoped and smaller than he'd feared, which put it in the range of manageable that was adjacent to but distinct from safe. He counted from the ridge, gesture counted for snow beside him, tapping fingers against his forearm. 80, maybe 90. Arranged in the loose non-formation of things that didn't sleep and didn't rest, but moved constantly in slow patterns that might have been patrol routes and might have been something older and stranger than patrol routes. One of them was separated from the main body by 40 yards, standing at the valley's eastern edge and looking at nothing with its wrong blue eyes. Logan looked at Tormund. Tormund looked at the separated white. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed. 3 men on the flanks cut off retreat to the main body. Then he looked at Logan and pointed at the white itself. Logan went down the ridge in a low, fast movement that kept him below the sight line of the main body, the cold air clean and sharp in his lungs. The snow compacted enough here to move across without the crunching that looser powder would have made. 40 yards. 30. The separated white still hadn't moved, still looking at its particular nothing, and Logan came up behind it and got the claws of his left hand around its throat in a controlled grip. Not to kill, not to sever, just to immobilize, while his right hand came around and seized the arm before it could react. It reacted anyway, because whatever the whites were, they weren't slow. And what followed was 30 seconds of controlled brutality that was the most physically demanding thing he'd done since arriving in this world. The white was strong with that complete unself-conscious strength he'd noted before, and it had no pain to manage and no instinct to preserve itself, and it threw itself against his grip with the absolute commitment of something that had no secondary concerns about what the struggle might cost. He held it. The chains came from 2 free folk rangers who'd followed him down, and the binding process was fast and practiced. Tormund had drilled it, clearly, and within 40 seconds the white was restrained, arms pinned, legs hobbled, still straining against the iron with that tireless, purposeless strength. 40 seconds was long enough. The sound it made, not a scream, nothing so human as a scream, a rattling exhalation that seemed to carry on frequencies below normal hearing, traveled across the valley and the main body moved. "Go," Logan said. They went. What followed was the most sustained running retreat he'd been part of since a situation in Korea that he still didn't like to think about. 13 men and 1 restrained white moving as fast as the terrain allowed, with 90 dead things behind them, closing the gap with that relentless, non-tiring pace that made endurance a losing game. The free folk moved beautifully in this terrain, jumping frozen streams and navigating ridge lines with the instinct of the native. The watch veterans moved well. Snow moved with a desperate, focused competence that was all controlled will. Logan carried the white. He'd taken it from the 2 rangers because it was slowing them down, and he wasn't slowing down. And he carried it the way he'd carried heavier things over longer distances in worse conditions, one-handed at times when the terrain required a free hand. the creature straining and rattling against the chains continuously and absolutely, broadcasting its location to anything that cared to listen. 3 miles, then 4. The dead things behind them were losing ground, not because they were tiring, they didn't tire, but because the terrain was working for the living in the ridgeline country. The frozen gullies and rock faces that the whites navigated with the patient persistence of things that had nowhere else to be, while the living navigated with the sharp adaptive intelligence of things that very much wanted to remain living. 5 miles from the valley, Tormund stopped at a frozen lake, wide and flat and defensible in the specific way that open ground was defensible when you needed to see what was coming and had something that could handle what you saw. Here, he said, breathing hard but controlled, we hold here until the raven's snow scent reached the queen's people. Logan set the white down. It immediately began working at the chains with that monotonous, mechanical persistence. He looked back at the tree line, at the dark shapes moving between the trunks at the edge of visibility. They'll wait, Snow said, watching them. They don't rush when they don't have to. They just... He stopped. Wait, Logan finished. Yes. Logan understood waiting. He'd done a lot of it over a very long life. And he'd learned that the thing about waiting was that it was only peaceful if you were the one with more time on your side. The dead things had more time on their side. But they'd come this far, and the white was chained, and somewhere to the south a queen with 3 dragons was moving toward a continent that was running out of time to be worth saving. Logan looked at the frozen lake and the tree line, and the wrong blue lights moving between the dark trunks, and he looked at Snow beside him, young and tired and completely unwilling to stop. And he thought that this was the kind of situation that revealed what people were made of, not in the comfortable retrospective sense, but in the immediate present tense sense, the sense that mattered. Snow was made of the right things. So were the men around him. It would probably have to be enough. From somewhere out in the dark, beyond the tree line, something that was not wind and not animal moved through the frozen air, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees in as many seconds, and the chained white went completely still for the first time since its capture. Chains slack, blue eyes fixed on the northern dark with something that Logan, who had seen fear on 1,000 faces in 100 years of conflict, could only describe as anticipation. The Night King was close. The Night King arrived the way absolute cold arrived, not as an event but as a condition, a state the world entered without announcement. The temperature had been dropping for 20 minutes, incremental and steady, and then it stopped being incremental. The lake's surface, already frozen, one contracted audibly, a deep, resonant crack that ran from the northern shore to the southern, like a fault line expressing an opinion. The trees at the tree line stopped moving. Not because the wind stopped, but because the wind became something else, became part of a larger stillness that pressed down on the lake and everything on it with the weight of something that had been cold since before the current age of the world had begun. Logan felt it in the adamantium first. The metal in his bones had never bothered him with cold before. He'd operated in Arctic conditions, had spent time in environments that froze equipment and incapacitated normal men, and the adamantium had always been neutral, indifferent to temperature in the way that very dense metal was indifferent. Now it ached, a deep structural ache, as though the coal was getting into the molecular lattice of the metal itself and finding spaces between atoms that it could inhabit. He filed that. Fear later. Information now. The Night King came through the tree line on a dead horse, and the dead horse moved with a horrible fluid grace, each step precise and weightless, hooves not quite breaking the snow's crust the way a living animal would have broken it. The Night King himself was... Logan searched for the right frame of reference and kept failing to find one that fit. He'd seen powerful men. He'd seen men who wore authority like a physical attribute. He'd seen things that weren't men over a long and varied life, things that occupied the category of other that most people never had to encounter. The Night King was the end of the category, and the thing the category had been building toward. He was tall and pale in a way that wasn't skin tone, but was something deeper, a pallor that went all the way through, and he wore armor that had grown rather than been forged, ice-born, shaped by will or magic or something that preceded both, the plates following the contours of his body with a perfection that human craftsmanship couldn't achieve, because human craftsmanship couldn't account for the body changing to suit the armor, rather than the armor being made to suit the body. His eyes were the same blue as the whites, but older, deeper, the blue of ice that had never been water. He stopped at the tree line and looked at them across the frozen lake. The chained white had gone completely still when he appeared. Anaran remained still. Not the stillness of restraint, but the stillness of a puppet whose strings had gone slack. Logan looked at the chains that were suddenly irrelevant, because whatever had been moving, it was now entirely focused elsewhere. "He's looking at you," Snow said quietly beside him. His voice was controlled with effort. "Yeah," Logan said. "I noticed." He'd been looked at by things that wanted to kill him before. The specific quality of this regard was different. It wasn't predatory. Predation implied appetite, and appetite implied need, and the Night King was past needing anything. It was more like being assessed by something that was deciding whether you were a piece on a board it was playing or an obstacle on a board it was clearing. Logan stared back. He'd outlasted a lot of things that had looked at him like problems to be solved. He intended to outlast this one. That intention probably didn't register on his face as anything the Night King could read, but it settled in Logan's chest as a physical fact, the same way the adamantium ache was a physical fact, and physical facts were what he worked with. The Night King raised one hand. From the tree line on both sides of the lake, the dead came out of the trees. What followed was not a battle in any sense that the word usually implied. It was a problem in arithmetic, the way truly overwhelming military situations always resolved into arithmetic. Not who was stronger or faster or braver, but whether the mathematics of the situation permitted survival. May Logan made the calculation in the first 10 seconds and arrived at an answer that was uncomfortable but not impossible. They could not hold the lake. The dead outnumbered them at ratios that made holding anything a losing proposition. They needed to move, needed to use the terrain and speed, and the specific advantages that living things had over dead ones, when those advantages were properly applied. He killed the first wave on reflex, the claws doing their work with the efficiency of long practice, and learned two things quickly. First, decapitation still worked. Second, the Night King was doing something, standing at the tree line, a slow, deliberate motion with both hands that had the quality of conducting, and where his hands moved, the dead moved with coordinated purpose that the whites hadn't shown before. Watch the random individual lurching replaced by something that was uncomfortably close to tactics. "He's directing them," Logan shouted to Snow over the noise of it. Snow was fighting with the focused economy of someone who had done this enough times to strip it down to essentials. Footwork, blade angle, the specific targeting that made each strike count. Longclaw, his Valyrian steel sword, carved through whites cleanly in a way the iron weapons didn't, and he used the difference ruthlessly. "I know," he called back. "We need to move." The white? Leave it. Logan looked at the chained white, still slack and puppeted still, and made the calculation. The mission had been to bring evidence south. The evidence was useless if none of them made it south to present it. He let it go. Tormund had already made the same calculation and was moving, pulling his people into a fighting retreat formation with bellowed freefolk commands that the Rangers responded to with impressive speed. They moved south along the lake's edge, which was the only direction that wasn't already closed, the dead pressing in from three sides with that coordinated, newly purposeful movement that the Night King's direction gave them. Logan fell back last because he was the one who could afford to fall back last. The next 10 minutes were the most purely violent he'd experienced in this world. Not the most dangerous he'd ever experienced in his life, because his life had included things calibrated specifically to kill him and equipped to do it, but violent in the honest, unambiguous way of a situation that had been reduced to its simplest terms. When he moved through the dead the way he'd moved through the whites in the clearing, but faster now and with less precision, the berserker efficiency that his body defaulted to when tactical consideration was a luxury the situation had stopped offering. The claws left trails in the cold air. The adamantium ached with that deep structural cold from the Night King's presence, and he used the ache as information. Direction and distance, the specific intensification, when the Night King's attention focused on him specifically, the slight easing when it moved elsewhere. A biological compass of sorts, calibrated to something that wanted him dead in a way that was different from the White's mechanical hostility. The Night King looked at him with something that, if it weren't impossible, Logan would have called recognition. He didn't have time to think about what that meant. He reached the rear of the group's fighting retreat and pushed them faster. And Tormund took the cue and pushed harder, and they came off the lake onto the southern bank and into terrain that worked better for them. Rough ground, rock outcroppings, frozen gullies that the dead navigated slower than the living, because the dead didn't adapt to obstacles. They accumulated against them. 3 more miles, then 2. The wall becoming visible above the tree line. White and absolute and suddenly very welcome. The dead fell behind incrementally, losing cohesion as the Night King's attention divided between directing the pursuit and Logan could feel it in the adamantium ache, the specific change in quality, doing something else. Something that required his focus more than the chase did. And he didn't know what. He intended to find out. They came through the gate tunnel with 4 dead and 3 wounded, which by any calculation of the situation they'd survived, was better than it had any right to be. The gate sealed behind them with a sound like finality, and the men who'd made it through stood in Castle Black's yard in the gray morning light and breathed and did not speak for a while, because there was a kind of silence that was owed to the dead and to the specific fact of having survived when others hadn't. And this was a world that understood that debt. Logan stood apart from the group and looked at his hands and let the healing finish its work. A deep cut along his forearm, nearly to the bone, that one of the Whites had managed with a broken blade in the last stretch. It closed slowly, slower than usual, and he thought about the Night King's cold and what it did to the processes that kept him running. Snow came and stood beside him. He had blood on his face that wasn't his, and exhaustion in his eyes that was. "He knew you," Snow said. "I thought so too." "How?" "I don't know." Logan turned his forearm over, watched the last of the cut seal. But he wasn't surprised to see me. Everything else on that lake was operating on instinct or direction. He made a decision when he looked at me. Something changed in what he was doing. Snow was quiet for a moment. "Melisandre would say the Lord of Light sent you here for a reason." "Melisandre says a lot of things. She's usually right." A pause. "Annoyingly." Logan looked at the wall. At the ice face of it, 700 feet of accumulated cold and ancient purpose, so holding back something that had just demonstrated it was getting harder to hold. He thought about the Night King's recognition, about whatever the creature had been doing in the last minutes of the chase that had required more of his attention than the pursuit. "A dragon," he said. Snow looked at him sharply. "That's what he was doing. At the end, when the chase was secondary." Logan kept looking at the wall. "Melisandre said he needed one. I think he found one." He paused. "Or he was calling one." The cold came off the wall in waves, patient and enormous. Somewhere across the narrow sea, a queen with 3 dragons had just become the most important variable in an equation that was running out of time. And somewhere beyond the wall, something ancient and cold and suddenly more purposeful than it had been yesterday was moving. And the 8,000-year-old mathematics of the wall's endurance were quietly beginning to fail. The raven from Daenerys Targaryen arrived 6 days later. Not from the queen herself, from her advisors, which was its own kind of answer about how seriously the message had been received. The language was careful and political and warm in the specific way that carefully political warmth was cold underneath. And it said essentially that the Dragon Queen was aware of the threat beyond the wall and was prepared to discuss the matter in person, and that Jon Snow was invited to Dragonstone to make his case, and that the Night's Watch's Lord Commander should bring whatever evidence he had found compelling enough to act upon. Snow read it twice. Then he looked at Logan. "She wants proof," he said. "She wants to see you," Logan said. "In Juan, the proof is an excuse to get you in the room." He'd read enough diplomatic correspondence across enough centuries to understand the difference between what a letter said and what a letter meant. "She's already half convinced. Advisors don't write letters like this unless the person directing them is already half convinced." "Tyrion," Snow said almost to himself. "That's his hand in the phrasing." He set the letter down. "I have to go." "Yes." The wall will stand while you're gone or it won't, Logan said. You being here doesn't change the mathematics. You being in a room with someone who has 3 dragons changes the mathematics. A pause. I'll stay. Snow looked at him. Yes, you don't have to. Someone who can smell them coming in the dark and heal what they do to him is more useful here than on a boat to Dragonstone. Logan held his gaze. Go. Make your case. Bring her north. There was more to it than that. They both knew there was more to it. The political complexities and the risks of the voyage, and the specific danger of walking into a foreign queen's stronghold and asking for help without having much to offer in return. But the core of it was simple, and they'd both arrived at the same simple core independently, which was the mark of 2 people thinking clearly about the same problem. Snow left 3 days later, with a small party and Davos Seaworth, who had the eyes of a man who had survived more political disasters than he'd planned on and had developed a philosophical relationship with the concept. Logan watched the ship until it was gone and then turned back to the wall. The Bolton situation resolved itself while Snow was at sea, which was not the resolution anyone had planned. Sansa Stark arrived at Castle Black on a stolen horse with a wildling woman named Brienne of Tarth. Not a wildling, he'd learn, but a knight of unusual convictions and considerable capability, and the specific expression of someone who had survived something by the thinnest possible margin and had not yet fully processed the fact of their survival. She was Stark through and through, the same gray eyes and bone-deep stubbornness. On and she looked at Castle Black in its black-clad garrison with the measured assessment of a woman who had learned to evaluate every room she entered for exits. Logan was on the wall when they arrived and came down to find Sansa already in conference with the acting commander, already asking the right questions about troop numbers and supply lines and whether the Northern Lords could be rallied. She'd been a prisoner in King's Landing and then a prisoner in Winterfell, and she'd come out of it not broken, but educated, which was a different and more dangerous thing. He sat across a table from her that evening while she ate, carefully, deliberately, the way people ate when they'd learned not to trust food, and she looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "You're the one John wrote about. Yash, the man with the metal claws who came from somewhere else. That's me. He said you helped him, that you went north of the wall with him." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, processing something. "He trusted you quickly." "John doesn't trust quickly." "Neither do I," Logan said. "It made things easier." She looked at him with the specific intelligence of someone who had survived by reading people accurately and had gotten very good at it. "Ramsay will come here," she said. It wasn't anxiety, it was planning. Establishing the facts so the response to it could be organized. "He won't let me go. Letting me go means losing something he owned, and he doesn't lose things he considers his." "I know. Can you fight his army?" Logan thought about the Bolton forces. Professional soldiers, disciplined, loyal to a man whose methods encouraged a particular kind of loyalty through a particular kind of fear. 20 against 13 had been the ranging. This would be different mathematics. "Not alone," he said, "but I'm not planning on alone." She looked at him, waiting. "The free folk," he said. "Tormund's people want south of the wall. What they need to make that happen is Winterfell under a Stark, not a Bolton, because the Northern Lords will follow a Stark, and the Northern Lords are what makes the free folk settlement politically viable." He watched her follow the logic. "John is at Dragonstone asking a queen for dragons, but there's a battle that needs fighting before he gets back, and the pieces for it are already here." Sansa was quiet for a long time. The firelight moved on her face and she looked very young, and also not young at all, which was a combination he recognized from people who had been through the specific education that cruelty provided. "You're talking about taking Winterfell," she said. "I'm talking about giving it back," he said. "There's a difference." What followed was 2 weeks of the most intensive preparation Logan had done since operations he still technically wasn't cleared to discuss, involving people whose names he still didn't say aloud. He worked with Tormund on free folk tactics, unconventional, aggressive, terrain-dependent, and with Brienne on conventional formations and the specific capabilities of the Bolton infantry. He walked the ground south of Winterfell in the gray pre-dawn, mapping sightlines and choke points with the same systematic attention he'd given Castle Black, building the picture that let him see the battle before it happened. He worked with Sansa on the political dimension, which was not his natural territory, but which he navigated with a sophistication that had clearly been purchased at significant cost. The letters she wrote to the Northern Lords were careful and precise, and strategically emotional in the way that the best political communication was emotional. Not manipulative, exactly, but aware that human beings made decisions with their whole selves, not just the reasoning parts. Some lords answered, "Not enough, never enough." The Bolton army arrived on the morning of the 14th day, and it was larger than their numbers were. Which was the nature of military mathematics when one side had resources and the other had conviction. Logan stood on a ridge south of Winterfell and looked at the enemy formation below and felt the old familiar feeling. Not fear, he'd made his peace with fear a long time ago, processed it down to something useful, but the specific heightened clarity that came when everything became simple. No politics, no ravens, no careful letters. Just the ground and the wind, and the people beside him, and the people across from him, and the work. He looked at Tormund on his left, red-bearded and absolutely ready, the readiness of a man in his natural element. He looked at Brienne on his right, tall and armored and holding her sword with the grip of someone who had decided how this went a long time ago, and was at peace with the decision. To he looked at Sansa, back at the tree line where he'd asked her to stay. She'd argued, he'd been immovable. She'd accepted it with the expression of someone who was filing this for future renegotiation. He looked at the Bolton line, at the flayed man banners moving in the cold wind, at the soldiers arrayed behind them with the professional confidence of a force that outnumbered its opponent and knew it. He looked for Ramsay Bolton specifically and found him. Center rear, mounted, watching the ridge with the detached, interested expression of a man who regarded this as entertainment that happened to have military dimensions. Logan had met men like that before. They relied on fear and spectacle, and the assumption that their opponent's morale would fail before their own logistics did. Well, they were very good at winning battles where those assumptions held. He extended the claws. All six, both hands. 12 inches of adamantium in the cold northern air, catching the gray morning light. The Bolton line saw it. He watched the ripple of reaction move through them. The specific disturbance that went through a formation when it encountered something outside its frame of reference. Professional soldiers were trained for most things. They were not trained for this. He went down the ridge at a dead run, and Tormund came beside him, roaring something in the free folk tongue that sounded like joy, and the line came with them. And the battle that historians of Westeros would later struggle to describe accurately, because the central figure in it was not something their historical frameworks had categories for, began. What Logan remembered afterward, as he always remembered afterward, was not the spectacle of it, but the granular, specific details. The crunch of frozen ground underfoot, the smell of blood and cold, and the specific fear sweat of men who had seen something they couldn't explain and were deciding whether to stand or run. Most of them stood because professional soldiers mostly stood, and he gave them credit for that, even while moving through their formation with the efficiency of something that had been doing this, in one form or another, since before any of them were born. He was looking for Ramsay Bolton. He found him at the rear, no longer mounted. The horse had made a sensible decision and removed itself from the situation. And Ramsay looked at Logan the way he'd looked at the battle, with that detached, interested expression. But there was something underneath it now. Something Logan recognized from men who had built their identities on being the most dangerous thing in any room, and had just encountered evidence that the category had a higher ceiling than they'd understood. "You're the one they've been talking about," Ramsay said. He had a hunting knife, and he was holding it the way men held knives when they were deciding whether the knife was relevant. Logan looked at him. At the knife, at the flayed man on his jerkin, and what that sigil represented, what it had meant to the small folk of the villages, to Sansa, to the specific geography of cruelty that this man had constructed around himself and called lordship. He thought about the one line he'd held, through 100 years and 100 wars, Even in situations where it would have been easy to cross it and arguably justified. He thought about what crossing it did to you, incrementally, the way water carves stone, not all at once but persistently, until the shape of you was different than it had been. He thought about Ramsay Bolton's victims, about what this man had done to people in his power, about the likelihood of that ending if Ramsay Bolton walked away from this field. He retracted the claws. Ramsay's expression flickered. Surprise, then something that might have been relief, then the hunting calculation of a man seeing an opportunity. He never got to use it. Sansa had not stayed at the tree line. Ramsay Bolton died the way he had lived, as the subject of someone else's considered decision. Sansa had not stayed at the tree line because Sansa Stark had spent 2 years being told where to stay and what to do, and had arrived at a place on the other side of all of it, where she understood the difference between wisdom and obedience. She'd watched the battle from the ridge, not the tree line, with Ghost, Jon's direwolf, who had appeared from the northern dark 2 days prior and attached himself to her with the quiet certainty of an animal that understood bloodlines. And she'd come down when the mathematics shifted, when the Bolton line broke, and Ramsay ran, and Logan let him run. She'd understood why Logan let him run. She'd also understood that Logan's reasons were his own and not hers, and that the debt Ramsay Bolton owed the North was not Logan's debt to collect. Logan stood back and watched it happen and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't peace exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific resolution that came from a situation arriving at the correct conclusion through the correct agency. This was Sansa's justice, in Sansa's land, for Sansa's people. He cleared the path. The path had been hers to walk. Winterfell's gates opened before nightfall. The ravens went south in a flock, to the remaining northern lords, to Castle Black, to a ship somewhere on the narrow sea that carried Jon Snow toward a queen with dragons. The message was simple and factual in the way that Sansa had learned to write messages, stripped of sentiment, presenting the essential information with the directness of someone who had watched ornate language be used against her and had developed a permanent preference for plainness. Winterfell stands. The North remembers. Come home. Logan sat in Winterfell's great hall that night, vast and smoke-darkened and full of the specific smell of a place that had been through several owners in rapid succession and was reasserting its original character now that its original family had reasserted theirs. And he ate hot food for the first time in 2 weeks and listened to the hall fill with the sound of people who had survived something and were processing the survival. Tormund was already negotiating terms with Sansa's people for the Free Folk settlement, which he did with characteristic directness. No flowery language, no posturing, just concrete requirements stated plainly and a willingness to accept concrete responses. It was going better than Logan had expected. Sansa's people had learned from Sansa, apparently, which meant they could recognize an honest interlocutor when they found one. Brienne sat nearby, armor off, the exhaustion of the battle replaced by something more sustainable. She caught Logan looking and nodded once. He nodded back. There wasn't much more that needed saying between people who had stood in the same line and done the same work. He thought about Snow, somewhere at sea or already at Dragonstone, making the case that Logan had watched him rehearse in Castle Black's yard in the early mornings. Not the specific arguments, but the shape of them. Shunted the particular challenge of convincing someone who had her own existential crisis to extend her attention to someone else's. Snow was honest to a degree that was almost tactically unsound, but Logan had lived long enough to know that extreme honesty in a world built on deception was its own kind of power. People didn't know how to defend against it. He thought about Bran and was answered almost immediately by a sound at the hall's far end, Hodor's distinctive large footstep pattern on stone. And then Bran was there, Jojen Reed beside him looking thinner than he'd been and further away in the eyes, as though whatever he'd been doing in the time since Logan had left him south of the wall had required him to be elsewhere while his body continued to occupy the present. Logan crossed the hall and crouched in front of Bran's carry position and looked at him. Bran looked back with eyes that had changed. Not the wrong blue of the whites, something entirely different, something older, The eyes of someone who had been somewhere vast and had come back with the knowledge that the difference between somewhere vast and somewhere small was mostly a matter of perspective. You saw him, Bran said. The Night King. Yes. He knew you. Not a question. The certainty of someone who had watched it happen from somewhere else. That's what Snow said too. Logan held the boy's changed gaze. What do you know about it? Bran was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet now. Not thinking exactly, but accessing. Watch the way a person accessed a memory, except the memory was larger than a normal memory and required more of him to retrieve. The Night King was made to destroy, he said finally, by the children of the forest, from a man. They pressed dragon glass into his heart, and he became something that couldn't be killed by normal means. A pause. He's encountered things he couldn't kill before. Not many. He remembers them. Logan looked at him steadily. And he'll come for me specifically. He'll come for everyone specifically, Bran said. But yes, you're a problem he wants to solve. The old young eyes regarded him with something that might have been compassion in a face that had moved past the expressions that usually accompanied compassion. He's been dead for a very long time. He doesn't like things that don't die. That makes two of us, Logan said. The answer from Dragonstone arrived 11 days later, carried not by Raven but by ship. Snow's ship, returning, and with it a second ship flying Targaryen colors, black sails with a three-headed dragon that the people of Winterfell's walls watched approach, with the specific mixture of awe and apprehension that the Targaryen sigil historically warranted. Logan was on the walls when the ships docked and watched Snow come down the gangplank with the expression of a man who had gone south to ask for help and had come back with something more complicated than help. Behind him came advisors and guards in the logistical apparatus of a queen in transit. Daenerys Targaryen came last. Logan assessed her the way he assessed everyone. It was a collection of capabilities and choices in the relationship between them. Young, deliberately composed, wearing her authority like armor that she'd had to learn to fit into rather than been born wearing. She had the silver-gold Targaryen coloring in the violet Targaryen eyes, and something in those eyes that was harder to categorize. The look of someone who had decided what she was going to be and was in the ongoing process of discovering what that decision cost. She looked at Winterfell, at the northern lords assembled in the yard, at Sansa, who looked back with the gray eyes and the particular stark assessment. Then she looked at Logan. He met her gaze and held it, and something moved across her face. Not recognition, but the expression of someone encountering something outside their existing framework and deciding to expand the framework rather than reject the encounter. "You're the one John described," she said. Her voice was steady and carried the slight formal precision of someone who had learned the common tongue perfectly and spoke it in a way that marked it as learned rather than native. "Probably," he said. "He said you went north of the wall, that you saw the Night King." "Yes." "He said the Night King recognized you." "Also, yes." She looked at him for a long moment with those violet eyes. Then precisely, why? It was, Logan thought, exactly the right question. Not what are you or how is that possible, but why? The question that went past the phenomenon to the implication. Sari, the Night King made something that's been the Night King made something that's been looking for things it couldn't kill ever since. He held her gaze. I'm one of them. Your dragons are probably another. Something shifted in her expression, the composed authority acquiring a new layer underneath it, the layer of someone who had just heard a thing that reorganized their understanding of their own significance. "Then we have something in common," she said. "We have a problem in common," he said. "That's a start." 3 days later, the wall fell. Not all of it. A section in the east where the Night King had been working since the ranging. The specific location of his focused attention in those final minutes on the frozen lake that Logan had noted and not understood until now. The magic within it failed in a cascade, the wards of 8,000 years unraveling in sequence like a knot pulled from one end, and through the breach came the deadened numbers that made the lake encounter look like a preliminary. Logan stood on Winterfell's walls and watched the horizon to the north, where the sky had gone a particular shade of wrong, and felt the adamantium ache settle into his bones like a permanent condition. Behind him in the yard, Daenerys Targaryen was speaking quietly to one of her dragons, Drogon, the largest, who listened with the attention of something that understood more than it expressed. The dragon's eyes, when they caught the torchlight, went north for a long time without speaking, north for a long time without speaking. "Is this survivable?" she asked finally. Logan looked at the wrong sky, at the wall's distant breach, at the cold that was already pushing south like a tide, finding a gap in the seawall. He thought about everything that had been assembled here. Free folk and northern lords, and a Stark in Winterfell, and a queen with dragons, and one man who had survived everything a longer and stranger life than any of them could imagine had thrown at him. He thought about the Night King's recognition, about being a problem something ancient wanted solved. He'd been a problem things wanted solved for over a century, and he was still here. "Ask me when it's over," he said. The dragon behind them made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a roar, and the warmth of it reached the walls, and for a moment the cold retreated a fraction. Just a fraction, just enough to remember what warmth felt like. The north prepared itself, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the broken wall, the Night King moved south through his army of the dead, patient and cold and ancient, toward the thing that didn't die, and the fire that didn't go out, toward the reckoning that 8,000 years of winter had been building toward. He had waited this long. He could wait a little longer. Logan had come to Westeros face down in river mud with arrows in his back and no map and no allies and no understanding of the rules. He left that version of himself in the Riverlands, in the mud, and became something the continent hadn't had a category for until he filled it. He had walked into Harrenhal's ruins and the Night's Watch's depleted garrison and the frozen hell north of the wall, and he had carried a dead thing through a blizzard and fought on a frozen lake and stood in a battle line south of Winterfell and watched justice find its correct owner. And through all of it, the claws had come out and gone back, and the wounds had closed, and he had remained, inconveniently, stubbornly, constitutionally, alive. The Night King knew what he was. That made him valuable and also made him a target, which was a combination he had extensive experience managing. Daenerys had dragons and the knowledge that her fire and his metal were two of the few things the dead couldn't simply absorb and continue. Jon Snow had returned with something harder to quantify than dragons: the specific moral authority of someone who had been right about the important thing when everyone else was focused on the convenient thing. The wall had fallen. Winter had arrived in its truest form, and in Winterfell's great hall, around fires that burned against the encroaching dark, the living prepared for the reckoning. Somewhere in the north, a wolf howled, then another, then the full Stark pack, voices rising together into the cold night sky above Winterfell. Logan listened, and something old in him answered, quiet and certain. He was still here. That would have to be enough. And somehow, looking at everything assembled around him in the firelight, he thought it might be.